Hello and welcome to Why Does It Matter? I'm Owen Kirby and I'm here with my colleague, Mervado Jurdi, from the University of Central Florida's Global Perspectives and International Initiatives. The topic of our episode today is the Middle East, engagement or neutrality. To help us answer this question, we're pleased to introduce as our special guest, Michael Harvey, former Assistant Administrator for the Middle East at the U.S. Agency for International Development. In an over 30-year career, Mike served in leadership positions at USAID missions in Jordan, Iraq, and the West Bank, Gaza, not to mention Nigeria and Serbia, among others, before returning to Washington to chair the USAID task force to defeat the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. In his final role at the agency, as Assistant Administrator for the Middle East, Mike oversaw the U.S.'s largest regional bilateral assistance portfolio. I'd like to thank Mike for being here today, getting up early on the West Coast to share his experiences and insights with us. And now I'll turn over the mic to Hakan Ozoglu, head of UCF's Middle East Studies program, to introduce our student panelists and to moderate our session. Thank you, Hakan.
Thank you. And thank you, Mike, for being here. We have 3 students to pose some questions on your area of specialty. They are Pauline Kabambi, Jared Friedline, and Alex Pani. And these 3 students are very much interested in the Middle East. I know Pauline has also special interest in Central Africa, where she's taking one of my courses on history of Iraq. And Alex is the MENA region intern in global studies at UCF. And I know Jared is also interested in the Middle East because he's taking one of my classes. And also he's working on cartography. We just talked about that and comparing Middle Eastern cartography and how the Middle East and the Ottoman Empire was drawn in maps. So they're very much interested in the region. And I'm very grateful that they volunteered to take parts in this. And we're gonna start. The students will ask my questions one by one to you. We have a limited time, so if the students can make the questions to the point and short. And let's start with Pauline, and then after that, Jared, and next Alex. We'll ask one by one, and then we will come back around. Pauline, what's your first question?
Yes, thank you so much for the opportunity for me to ask these questions. So one of my questions is, how does the U.S. International Development Program help leverage human capital and improve institutional check and balances and provide basic social services and increase inclusive citizen participation and accountability in the Middle East?
That's you're basically covering the waterfront with your question, Pauline. Developing human capital is one of the foundational elements of the U.S. Foreign Assistance Program globally. And a lot of that is premised on the fact that unless we give young people the talent and the ability to successfully engage in the modern world, their countries are going to have a much harder time, if maybe not the possibility of, truly transforming into participatory democracies where there's accountability, transparency, and the level of economic growth that enables the aspirations of young people to be realized. But it's really important to remember that outside actors, including outside actors with large checkbooks like the US government, cannot make these things happen in countries unless there is a political will and a government committed to investing and pushing in the same direction. And so where the United States government can find committed partners, we can make a difference. When you haven't got one, all the investment in the world will either simply be holding ground or slowing a descent.
Thank you. And the answer was also to the point. And let's have Jared ask the second question.
Hi, and thank you for having me here to ask you this question. I was wondering, in your experience with the humanitarian aid in Ethiopia, how can that be some sort of a model for humanitarian aid in the Palestine-Israel region?
Very different circumstances, Jared. In Ethiopia, you're talking about children in particular, who are actually facing the prospect of death through malnutrition or death through disease that is worsened or made possible because of malnutrition. That is simply not the case in the situation with the West Bank and Gaza. For the most part, you're dealing with a middle-class population that is struggling to prosper and to make ends meet, but it's very seldom that you're dealing with great degrees of actual malnutrition among the population, even in Gaza, which is just a horrific situation in terms of people making ends meet. So I wouldn't say that there is a lot of lessons learned to go from Ethiopia to West Bank and Gaza, but there are principles that have got to be maintained in any humanitarian assistance project, humanitarian assistance endeavor, which is transparency, accountability, and integrity in selecting who gets support, ensuring that the contracting for the transport of foreign assistance is clean and clear, and that stuff does not go, physical commodities do not go astray. One of the things that we've been doing in the West Bank and Gaza, in partnership with the World Food Program, is actually using the equivalent of a debit card, an actual card with which beneficiaries can go to the market, buy what they want from a select list of goods, rather than actually giving hard physical food aid commodities, which is what we normally do in Ethiopia, where you simply haven't got markets functioning at a level that you can provide debit cards to 1 million people. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you. Alex, how about you? What's your question?
And again, Mr. Harvey, thank you again for taking the time to be here. So I wanted to ask, how can the United States support embattled democratic regimes in the Middle East without creating a dependency on American humanitarian and military aid?
And let me add one more thing on the end of your list, without sort of getting blamed for the shortcomings. Because one of the things that has really struck me is that for all of the rhetoric that you hear, that the problems in the Middle East and other countries that are struggling with transition, that the problems in the Middle East are caused by outside actors, specifically the United States, I consistently see them as a deep source of frustration and disappointment, because it is enabling political elites in particular, but also, if you will, sort of democratic middle class from taking responsibility for directing the future of their own country's political development. If Egypt is going to succeed, it's going to be because of Egyptians, not because of anything the Americans or any other outsider does. Mm-hmm. The same is true in Libya, Algeria, Lebanon, Iraq. So I think it's incredibly important that all of us understand that if the countries of the Middle East are going to make this jump to being sort of democratic cultures and democratic systems, that it's going to take an effort by the peoples of that region to chart their own course, see their own vision, and ensure that the values of their culture and of their people are finding expression in their political system, while also ensuring that political system is transparent, accountable, and delivers. Now, having said that, there is a role that outsiders can play. There is a role the Americans can play. I am proud of the fact that the United States still stands as a model for democratic society and democratic systems that people around the world still look to for both inspiration, guidance, and support. I strongly believe in the model of, the line of a shining city on the hill. I think it's more important that the United States be a credible, honest model for democratic practices, which means that our own internal behaviors have to be consistent with those values. Now, no country is perfect. Every country's uh, expectations of itself should exceed where they are. Never, if you can ever meet your own values, then your values aren't high enough. But what we have found is that there are ways that the United States can help countries that are trying to make this transition. And often it's by coming up, well, not often, it is primarily by coming up alongside those people in Libya, in Egypt, in Jordan, in Lebanon, who have a vision for moving their country toward modern, accountable democratic systems, and encouraging them, supporting them, giving them the tools they need to help move their country forward. It's touching to me when I see young people in a rural village in Tunisia, for example, taking control of their town, organizing a park, and getting the sports system up and running where they've never had one. They did it, but they did it in partnership with, I think it was a European NGO that came up alongside them that said, here's how we did it in our town. And they helped the kids sort of organize themselves, help them engage the adults in the community. And the adults in the community were actually like, this is kind of cool. In a society where young people have very little expectation of ever opening their mouth on political matters, let alone municipal governance matters. And what I strongly believe is that we can model and also teach practices of how you organize a culture, organize a society in a way that gets better outcomes than some of these societies have. And the reality is, this is going to happen because of the ubiquitous presence of the internet. A kid in rural Tunisia sees how people live elsewhere in the world. He can see the disconnect between the world on the internet, the world outside of Tunisia, and the reality of his life in a rural community. What I would like to think all of us can do as people who come from a much more privileged and much more open experience can help that young man or woman see, here's how you get from where you are to where you want to go. He still has to do it. You're not going to do it for him. And if you try to do it for him, you're going to mess it up. But if you can enable that kid to take possession of his vision and enable him to succeed, sometimes being almost a go-between between him and his parents, and just telling his parents, just trust him, it'll get there. That's the kind of role we can play. But we can't take ownership of these problems. And that's a step that often in our good intentions we want to take. But that's going to lead you to places where you're actually disempowering that young kid from actually being the guy who drives the change in his own community.
It was a very good long answer to a very controversial subject, I guess, especially being discussed in different parts of the world, role of outsiders in stabilizing or destabilizing the regimes around the world. Thank you, Mike, for that. Let's go back to Pauline. What's your second question, Pauline?
I think my second question, just on follow-up with what you just said. You mentioned that sometimes some of the limitation that happen in this area is usually the willingness of the government or the people. And my question is more about women rights in the Middle East. In recent years, we saw some improvement in women's rights. We saw now that Tunisia women have greater protection against domestic violence. We saw that in Saudi Arabia now women can drive. So my question is, how do you think the role of international development can play in improving improving women's rights in the Middle East? Is there any role that the international development assistance can do in that area?
There is. It needs to be done respectfully, and it needs to be done carefully, but it needs to be done clearly. When USAID or the World Bank or any international donor goes in and tries to initiate programs in a given community, hopefully initiatives that are being driven by the community and not by the outside, but that's a separate conversation. it is becoming standard practice that, if there has to be a community committee pulled together to lead that project, it's going to be 50-50 men and women. If there is a city council program and we're trying to support local elections, then we're going to make sure that the local elections board is a solid mix of men and women. And we will probably be supporting separate standalone programs just to help women learn how to get politically involved, how to stand for public office as a city councilwoman, for example. It's a deliberate effort. I, for one, strongly disapprove of requiring X number of percentage of gender participation, just because I think it's not sincere. But that's a point of discussion that I think people can have. Some places have absolutely been very clear that there will be 50% women on the city council and 50% men on the city council. And that's coming out of the community, in which case I say, absolutely, that's the way it should go. And it has worked. But these are, let's be clear, outside ideas coming into these communities. Again, often because the women in these communities, they've got access to the internet just like the young people do. They see how the rest of the world is changing and they're demanding change. Again, our role is come up alongside women who want to push in that direction, equip them, enable them, support them, encourage them, protect them sometimes. But it's got to be driven internally. And I would be hard pressed to find a place where women aren't pushing to come forward into a more forward role in their communities. So they're always there. It's just finding the appropriate way to support them.
This is a very important question, the gender. Thank you, Pauline, for bringing it up. Obviously, it needs a lot more detailed discussions and research, but it's a very sensitive subject. Jared, what do you think? What's your question? Your second question?
My second question is, when you provide aid to an area that has mass conflicts and all that, how do you remain neutral, and who decides who gets food, who doesn't get food, and all that, or resources in that area, conflict area?
The issue of not taking sides is hard, and it comes up every single time. Right now in Ethiopia, for example, if you go to Addis Ababa and you talk to a man on the street or a woman on the street, they will tell you with complete certainty that the foreign community supports the Tigrayan rebels, they call them, operating in northern Ethiopia. During the Bosnian conflict, it probably was true that there was overwhelming support for the Bosnians in the face of the atrocities committed by the Serbs. And the fact that I would say it just like that betrays my own sympathies in how that conflict spilled out. The issue of neutrality and in these conflicts is a foundational principle that we have to hold onto when we work in conflicts. It is a very hard principle to hold in cases where it is very, very clear who the bad guy is. And yet, when it comes to identifying people who are in need, it needs to be driven. Politics has no role. A 5-year-old child knows no politics. And when you're trying to figure out who needs help and who needs assistance, whether it's food aid, it's medical care for cholera, it's immunizations, those programs must be neutral, and they must be driven entirely by an independent assessment of need. For the most part, I think at the end of the day, the humanitarian assistance community does a very good job of holding that principle in front of itself all the time. Even when you're walking into a Bosnian community that's just been wiped out, you still have to be just as concerned about the guys on the left side of the street as you are the guys on the right side of the street. It's hard, I can tell you from personal experience.
Very brief pause there, but I think we recovered nicely. Thanks for the answer. Alex, what's your question?
So my second question regarded in what ways does the U.S. engage directly with people and private organizations in the Middle East as opposed to governments through aid programs? And what is the value of these non-government assisted programs to U.S. foreign policy?
That's a very good question. And as I answered, I want you to be very clear that when I talk about non-government people, the most important sector is the business sector and the private sector specifically. Because for almost any country that you're talking about where you're dealing with conflict, it's a conflict that's driven by resources, it's driven by exclusion, it's driven by old resentments. And the best cure for any of those is a healthy, strong, open economy. And so a big part of what the US government supports around the world, whether it's Department of State, Department of Treasury, USAID, World Bank, is trying to ensure that countries that are dealing with conflict, either brewing conflict, active conflict, or in a post-conflict situation, is that you've got strong, healthy, growing economies that dissipate all the negative energy that can build up within societies. Mm-hmm. I'm actually doing a segment this week on Rwanda, which is one of the saddest cases in modern history in Africa. And Paul Kagame's he has 2 points that drive that government, successfully or not, as reconciliation, trying to take apart the things that drive people away into their identity corners and away from national unity, and economic growth. And that government has been just maniacal on doing everything they can to ensure that there's a growing economy. That has been a big part of what USAID was pushing both in Iraq and Afghanistan for 20 years, trying to get healthy, open economies plugged into the broader global economy. In Afghanistan, I think we were working from too deep a hole. Iraq was driven by so much intercommunal conflict, but even in Iraq, we're now seeing the blossoming of an economy that is starting to open up opportunities. But if you go to the West Bank, you go to Lebanon, you go to Egypt, especially Egypt, which is such a closed, elite-controlled economy, a lot of what we have focused our attention on is finding young people, supporting them through entrepreneurial training, providing capital, either venture capital or others, to enable these guys to build businesses that sort of leapfrog the old traditional elite-controlled economic structures, get them plugged into the broader economy, especially the IT economy, which knows no borders, right? If you're a Palestinian kid stuck in some little town that's got a settlement boxing him in on the north and settlement boxing him in on the right, if he has to deal with the border crossings to get to the ports at Haifa, he's stuck. But the beauty of the internet is you just push a button, right? There's no crossing point. There's nothing. And it gives hope. It doesn't resolve the underlying conflict. And that's an important thing to say. But it does provide an option for especially young people to move on and start to build lives for themselves and give them hope. Because the absence of hope takes peoples and countries into very, very dark, bad places.
Thank you. I know our students have many other questions. I know they listed, but since we're almost out of time, and I would like to ask a question if it's possible to answer it. After that, we can turn the floor to Owen. My question is that I know in our school there are many students are interested in the career path that you are in, and what kind of suggestions would you give to students in college, students, and perhaps afterwards too, once they go to graduate school, to follow your footsteps?
Well, we all have our own paths. Mine was a very crooked path, so don't follow mine. Although it was fun, it was unique. I think one of the most important things that all of you all need to be able to show when you walk in the door is a reason for them to talk to you. What have you got that the guy down the hall hasn't got? And work experience is probably the most important one. Life experience helps. But for those of you who can, working in the NGO community, working in the contractor community that have done business with the United States government is a hugely effective way to build credibility that you can then use to transition into government, if that's a path you want to take. It is, if you are interested in humanitarian assistance world or the transition assistance world that Owen comes out of with OTI and OFTA in Washington, you really have to go overseas. You have to work for a contractor or an NGO that is working in a conflict zone. And you've got to just earn your stripes and have the credibility to say, been there, done that, know how it's done, know how it's not done. I will tell you that I am extremely critical of AID's recruitment processes. We went through a major hiring burp while I was there, and I was not successful in pushing on the checklist that we were looking for who we were interested in. We followed a State Department model, which was take young people who were green and turn them into aid officers. AID is not the State Department. We are the AID. It's a very practical, get it done culture. And I'm not that interested in getting somebody who's green when there's so many people out there in the contractor community who actually know what they're doing. So I'll leave it there. So that's my advice. Find a contractor, find an NGO, get overseas.
Well, thank you. This was very informative and thought-provoking. Now let me turn the table to Mirva for closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ozoglu, Pauline, Alex, and Jared. We wish you the best. Thank you, Mike, for being with us today and sharing your perspectives from an incredible lifetime career and experience. Thank you all for this. That's all for this episode of Why Does It Matter? Thank you for watching from the University of Central Florida's Global Perspectives and International Initiatives. See you next time.